I'm Gene Dahlhoff with the Madison Region Economic Partnership. It is my pleasure to introduce your speaker for this session, Dr. Amanda Weinstein. Dr. Weinstein is an associate professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Akron. She graduated with a PhD in agricultural, environmental, and development economics from The Ohio State University, where she worked as the graduate research assistant for the C. William Swank Program in Rural-Urban Policy. She has consulted for various organizations, including the OECD, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, Ohio Consumers Council, and the Southern Poverty Law Center. Before earning her PhD, she was a senior business analyst for Bearing Point, and she was also a commissioned officer in the U.S. Air Force after graduating from the U.S. Air Force Academy. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Weinstein.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Oh, I was like, oh, I know we're in, I think it's like Badger country, right? So I was like, oh, I'm trying not to mention the Ohio State Buckeyes. I'll talk a little bit about the Buckeyes, but not a lot. So this is based on a lot of research I've done with my colleagues actually in Muncie, Indiana, at Ball State, Mike Hicks and Emily Warnell, largely focusing on quality of life and how we view quality of life, and really focusing it on an economic development strategy. It's not just something nice to do, that it actually is how you move economies forward. So before we do that, I was not a history major, and I used to really not like history, but now I kind of love it. So we're gonna go back a little bit in time and look at the jobs. So this is a picture of where our jobs were in terms of different industries and occupations. So we can see from 1860 on, a lot of farm jobs when we started off, right? When those farm jobs started to get essentially automated away, what they were replaced with was production and manufacturing. And it was very intentional. So we had programs specifically to bring manufacturing to rural areas as a way of dealing with the employment loss from agriculture. But since 1979, which was the peak for manufacturing jobs, those jobs have dropped 34%. And that's what you see at the bottom, that blue there, closer to now, where you see that declining. That's where you see the decline in manufacturing jobs, not unlike what we saw in ag, when we see automation and other trends kind of reducing the number of jobs we need to manufacture goods. So when we look at that drop and who's really affected by the drop in manufacturing, that occurs all over, but mostly in the Midwest and the South. It also is more likely to be occurring in non-metropolitan areas. These are the areas most affected by that drop in manufacturing jobs. So what that means is a lot of rural communities are struggling. We know they're struggling. And research shows that when we rely too much on any industry, that has risks associated with it. This is true. So my family's actually all from Michigan. They were all in the car industry, right? We know stories of Detroit and Bay City and Flint, right? When you rely too much on any industry, there are risks. And the risks are when that industry goes away, it can take the town down with it. And that's what we see, whether it's metro or rural areas, that when you rely too much on an industry, you get lower growth. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of rural areas that are struggling. So this graph on the right, if you look at the definition of rural areas today versus urban areas, we can see they're struggling, especially compared to urban areas. So when we see communities struggling, what we often see is policymakers, they want to save them. And they think, well, that manufacturing company that we once had, right, our town relied on it. So maybe we could get another manufacturing plant in to save our town. And they often turn to what I call traditional economic development strategies, right? Basically, it's throwing money, hoping a company will come and save your town, kind of like Superman. But this strategy, which was actually started in rural areas in Mississippi, largely, to replace those ag jobs, it increasingly works less and less. For every area, but especially for rural areas, it just doesn't work. They're at an increasingly disadvantaged place to even try to attract large firms. And even if they do attract those large firms, are they really going to save the town like some kind of Superman? right? So it's not lost on me that Superman was created, the Man of Steel, in Cleveland, where we view steel as kind of saving the town, right? Will it save it? Sorry, a lot of my references come from kids' movies now, so just kind of roll with it. If you haven't seen it, I'll explain it. So we really want it to be like Superman, and I do believe that people advocating for these policies are really trying to save these towns. The problem is that instead of Superman, it ends up being like Syndrome from The Incredibles, where it's not really a superhero, it's not gonna save the town, and it does worse. It actually wrecks the town. It destroys the very thing it's trying to create because it's not really a superhero, and it's not really gonna save us. So it ends up being this kind of vicious cycle where we see struggling places from rural to metro focus on these traditional economic development strategies where they try and lure this big business in. But we know it doesn't work. How do we know? So this one's a hard one for a lot of policymakers because you saw the ribbon cutting, right? We saw the picture. We saw the ribbon cutting. We heard the jobs. Intel's going to bring 3,000 jobs. Right? It's going to bring jobs, right? Right? It's going to come save us by bringing those jobs to us. The problem is you're only measuring one part of the equation, and there's a lot of parts of the equation. It's not just the ribbon cutting, right? So when you go back and look at who actually created more jobs, the firms that got those incentives failed to create more jobs than similar firms. Similar firms that didn't get the incentive created more jobs. What happens is those incentives can crowd out economic activity. So yes, they brought in the 200 jobs or the 1,000 jobs, but what you don't see on the back end is it also crowds out other activities. People who were going to start a business decide not to. And that business would have had a bigger impact than the one that you brought in. Nobody loves a town more than the people who are already there. You're never going to bring someone in who's going to love that town more. How do I know? Because the people that are there have chosen to be there. They're the ones that love that town. They're the ones that will save that town, not bringing somebody else in. And that's what the research shows. And part of this is, I don't know if we have any politicians. You don't have to raise your hand if we have politicians in here. But, oh, we got one. All right. Politicians don't make good stockbrokers, and we shouldn't ask them to be stockbrokers, right? It's not because they're bad politicians, it's because they're not stockbrokers. If this economic development strategy worked, every politician would be a billionaire. I'm assuming you're not a billionaire, ma'am. No, yeah, yes, right? They're just not good at picking winners, at picking the companies that will do the economic development work. They're just not. Are you saying small businesses?
Yes.
Oh, we're going to get to small businesses. You're my audience. Small businesses, I'll have a slightly different story. So when we look at what this does, how it crowds out activity, right? You bring in a large plant, now you're over-reliant on one firm, right? And for the stockbrokers, we know you have to diversify your assets. It doesn't diversify your assets. Politicians aren't good at picking that one stock that's going to grow. They're not going to be good at picking that one large firm. But it also comes at a cost, right? Economists annoyingly say there's no such thing as a free lunch all the time. There's no such thing as a free business, right? That business that's asking for money, right, it will crowd out money from somewhere else. You're either asking residents to pay for that, or you gotta cut. What are you gonna cut? Schools? Roads? What are you gonna cut? It comes at a cost. So although we measure that ribbon cutting, we don't measure the costs that come along with it. So I'm gonna give you a story from Muncie, where my co-authors are from, of the Ball Corporation, right? So this strategy has its roots at a time when it did work. Now that time was 1887, so we're gonna go back quite a bit for this to actually work. So in 1887, Muncie did successfully lure the Ball Corporation, and it put it on the map, literally, right? It went from a town of almost no one to a town, a real town in Indiana, right? And it didn't take much. Fast forward 111 years later, and Ball Corporation, who when they moved to Muncie, one of the Ball brothers actually said, we didn't move there because the town was nice. We don't think Muncie's nice. Like, sorry if anyone's from Muncie, right? But that is what he said, right? 111 years later, they moved to Colorado. They moved to a place where people arguably think is one of the nicest places in the country. So the corporation, who didn't locate in a place not because it was nice, is now locating to a place specifically because it's nice, not because it has lower costs, not because they gave them money. In fact, they have higher costs in Colorado. Everything is more expensive in Colorado. We're talking, if you've been to Colorado lately, everything is more expensive in Colorado, right? Is it because they're bad at business? No. They had a very clear strategy, right? So sometimes when I talk with policymakers, like, all right, what if we just make the incentives bigger? What if we offer more money, right? That'll do it. No, right? It just makes the problem bigger. Everything I just described, that vicious circle, gets bigger when you throw more money at it, and that's exactly what we're doing. Each year we're throwing more and more money at a strategy that just doesn't work. And if it did work, all right, this is where we get into the Buckeye State here. Ohio would be the fastest growing state in the nation. It's not. For decades, if you follow Site Selection Magazine, Ohio regularly ranks #1 at attracting large businesses. We tout our 5th lowest corporate income taxes, or income tax revenue, in the nation. And what do we get for that? Ohio is 45th in population growth. For the first time this year, we had population decline. 47th in job growth. If this strategy worked, you'd all be in Ohio right now, and I would be in Ohio talking to you, probably. We're not in Ohio right now. This strategy doesn't work, and making the strategy bigger just makes the problem worse. Not only does it make the problem worse, it also makes it worse for areas, not only metro, but also rural areas. So we have, so this is actually research from a friend, we know that if you increase the ability of states to do this strategy, to have the freedom to throw all this money at large corporations, it has an especially negative effect on rural areas. It doesn't benefit rural areas, and we can see that. So we can see it in the data, we can see it in the economic development of rural areas, so you can also see it on a map. So if we're looking at Ohio, right, if this strategy worked for rural areas, all the pink that you see there, which is decline, would be that bluish-green color, which is growth. It's not what we see. But there are a lot of rural areas doing well. So the first graph I showed you with rural decline there, or not doing as well as the urban areas, is based on today's definition of what a rural area is. What if we looked at a 1950 definition? How did rural areas, as defined to be rural in 1950, what if we compared those to urban areas? That's the far right graph. Suddenly, those areas are doing actually better than urban areas, right? So on the left, you might say, man, rural has a lot to learn from urban, right? What can they learn? The far right graph says the other story. Urban's got a lot to learn from rural. What can urban areas learn from rural? So if we look at the rural areas that are doing well, they tend to have a lot of great amenities, a place where people want to be, and they tend to be near a metro area. So we find this over and over, and it's usually just thrown out as, hey, if you're a rural area and you're near a metro area, good for you, you can do well. But you don't stop to ask why. Is it because everyone from the metro area is commuting to the rural area for all the jobs there? No. If anything, people live in the rural areas and commute to the metro areas for the jobs there. But what does that say about the rural area? That's where people want to live. You don't even have to make them. Rural areas have always been nice places to live, and people know it. This is why being near a metro area helps rural areas, because people can live where they want to live and drive to a job in a whole bunch of industries in a metro area nearby. So when I was doing this research about quality of life, I thought of it as this revolution, this sudden, big change that we've seen in our economy. But the more I dug into it, the more I found that that was just simply not true. This has been going on for over a century. We have seen continued development in terms of the importance of quality of life for economic development. And some places, sorry, California, just kind of lucked into it based on when they came to be states and cities. So when Chicago, so we have Chicago to thank for this, so when Chicago connected the entire US so anyone could easily get from anywhere to California, people started going to California. And California wasn't offering companies money to be there. The very first thing they advertised at the very bottom there is they said, hey, come live in California. Why? Because it's a comfortable, healthy place to make a home. It's a nice place to live. From its very beginning, in the 1900s, they started saying, we're a nice place to live. So if you've been to San Diego, this is actually a picture of the Hotel del Coronado, a famous hotel there. It was built as a place that was just like, hey, come enjoy the air, and it's a nice place to be, and then people stuck around because it was such a nice place to be. Businesses there, policymakers there said, let's build on that. Let's just be a nice place to live, right? So much so now that California, I don't think, can quite fit everyone anymore. So we've known this about metro areas for quite a while. All right, so this is from research back in 2001, that the success of cities hinges more and more as cities' roles as centers of consumption, not production, right? It's about what we consume, what we want in that area, right? So Boise, so hot right now, right? Boise, all about a place people just want to be. So when you look at what mayors are doing of these cities, so this is from 21, so 20 years later, mayors are like, oh, we're gonna listen now. But mayors are now shifting from attracting firms to attracting residents by improving quality of life. But that's big cities. A lot of our research is focused on big cities, in part because we just didn't have the data methodology to use some of this quality of life research for smaller towns. So what my co-authors and I did is we wanted to change that. Use what we have, right? So I think a lot of rural areas know you might not have access to the same thing as the metro areas, but you have to use what you have, right? So what data do we have to use to do the same quality of life methodology to find out how quality of life is affecting non-metro areas? So for this, because I'm an economist, we use markets, right? So it's not what I think is nice, or what some reporter is saying the top 5 places to live is nice, right? So they will usually show their methodology. It's usually sitting in a room saying, I think this is nice, and I think this is nice, right? This is based on markets because this is where people make choices on where to live, where to buy a house, where to work. And when people do this every day, they don't know it, but I'm watching, right? I can pick up their preferences. I can find out what they like. I can find out what they don't like. And if you've ever bought a house, which we probably have a lot of homeowners in here, right? A real estate agent's favorite 3 words, location, location, location. We know that when you buy a house, it's not just the number of rooms or the size, but it's where that house is. Why? You are buying the location, right? So what that means, this is my favorite thing about housing markets, you can start to figure out what about a location people like. If they are willing to pay a premium for that house, above and beyond the number of rooms and the size, there's something about that location they're willing to pay for, that they like. And it's also true for labor market. So this one people kind of sometimes like, really? We're willing to accept lower wages if we like an area. So sometimes I'll be speaking with some of my friends. I have a friend who's in HR, and she's like, oh yeah, we have a location, I won't name the city. We have a location in fill in the blank. You can fill in the blank with what you want. We tried to get an accountant there. We had to pay this person twice as much as what we pay in San Diego. Of course you do. They didn't want to live there, right? You had to pay them to be there. So firms can actually save money too on this if you live in a nicer place. So when I was working with my co-author at Brookings, John Austin, he was like, oh yeah, that's Traverse City. I was like, what do you mean that's Traverse City? He's like, oh, everyone says about Traverse City, it's where you get half the pay for a view of the bay. People like it. They already know. They are willing to live there, and they're actually willing to accept lower wages to live there, because it's a nice place. But Traverse City wasn't always like that. It's actually traditionally manufacturing. It typically had cherry canneries all along its waterfront. Its waterfront doesn't have those cherry canning factories anymore. It now has, you can see the cute downtown, and you can see the streets there where you have your boats and your kayaks right in the water, and it's got breweries and wineries, right? It's a place where they tout all 4 seasons, right? This is the place you want to be all year round. So what we look at is this premium that people are willing to pay to be in those locations. So this is a look at every small town across the US as defined by a micropolitan area, and it looks at those premiums. So if you look at the y-axis, these are our housing premiums. So the higher you see up there are the more people are willing to pay in terms of higher housing to live there. So if you look on the bottom, that's our labor market, wages. So when that's lower, people really like that area. So our top left corner here, these are all the small towns that people just love to live in. They are nice places to live. And some of the big standouts there you can see, places like Kauai, Hawaii, the Garden Island, gorgeous places. We can see places like Teton County, Wyoming. So these are all counties. These are places that are just gorgeous. They are nice places to live. So on the top right quadrant, these are places that kind of have a balance. People and businesses generally think they're nice places to live, but also good places to work. So we see kind of a balance between the two. A lot of them tend to have, so they tend to be places where there's like Coast Guard. So they have a coast, they also have the Coast Guard, things like that. So the bottom right, these are places that are a great place to work. A lot of them rely on natural resources. So you might see a lot there from Texas where they do a lot of drilling. Man, does that pay well. So I have a friend that's a petroleum engineer, doing fine. Pays well, great place to work. Maybe not as great a place to live, but great place to work. So the one quadrant your place would not want to be in would be the bottom left. I won't spend a lot of time here, but a lot of these places have some deep-rooted issues. So if you look at Newton, Arkansas, home to the KKK, people don't want to live there. This affects everything about their economy, right? And if you start to dig in, so in my work, I have never found an outlier that's just randomly there. They have a story. Every place has a story. All the places in the bottom left have a story, and the story is usually troubling and not good. So we'll leave the bottom left. All right, so these are the premiums for all of the small towns across the US. The next slide I'm going to show you for just the Midwest. So I want you to see where these dots go. The scale and the axes are the same. Shrinks. In the Midwest, for our small towns, we don't have places that are leaning into being nice places to live the same way that other towns are in other areas. We do have small towns that are leaning heavy into the bottom right corner in terms of really leaning into the quality of the business environment, into being a good place to work. There's more focus on the quality of the business environment than there is the quality of life. So I have a cute little picture. One of the closest I found is Mercer County, Ohio. So that's where Salina is. They do have this cute little festival every year, kind of quirky. Go float your car on the lake and do hot air balloons, right? I don't know the story of how those two things go together, but they do, and people like super love it. So what these premiums get us is once we take from these markets, right, where people are choosing to live and where they're paying to live, where they're paying these premiums, we can get an estimate of quality of life for every county across the US. So here, the darker blue are places that have high estimated quality of life, right? So some of the darker blue areas you might see pop up, right? The coasts, right? People like beaches, not shocking. You also see the mountains from Idaho down to Colorado. People also like mountains, not shocking. Midwest, actually doing okay in a lot of areas. Illinois would maybe be the biggest kind of exception for all the states. But you also see some areas for the orange pop up, Appalachia, right? Struggling. So it tells us something about what people like, but I can also use the same markets to tell you where business is like. So if you have to pay a business to come to your town, that business doesn't like your town. So I think of it as like if you have to go to dinner and the only way your friend will come to dinner with you is if you pay for them to come to dinner, you don't have a friend, right? I don't know what it is, it's not a friend. Same thing for a business. If that friend will come to dinner with you and pay for their own dinner, yeah, you probably got a friend there, or someone that wants to have dinner with you, right? We can use these same markets to see where businesses want to be, where they want to be, where you don't have to pay them to come. Some areas similar, some areas a little bit different. So what this methodology gets us is now a way to answer a kind of perpetual question for my field, and it's kind of our chicken and the egg problem question. Do jobs follow people, or do people follow jobs? Which is it? Because that story I told you about Muncie, so I actually told my class that, and I saw one of my students sort of nodding and smiling, and I'm like, okay, you clearly have something to say here. Like, what are you picking up on this story about Muncie and Ball Corporation? And she said, my boyfriend just got a job with Ball, and we're gonna move to Colorado, probably. Right? So I imagine how that kind of goes when he tells his family in Ohio, we're gonna move to Colorado. And they say, well, he's moving to the job out there, and that's where the jobs are. But we don't often stop to ask, why is the job in Colorado? Why is that job in Colorado and not Indiana anymore? So when we use this methodology, we now have a measure of quality of life and the quality of the business environment. What matters? So here I focus not only on small towns, here I'm really narrowing down small towns in the Midwest. We can see a strong relationship here that higher quality of life is associated with higher population growth, so that's the one on the left. It's also associated with higher job growth. That's the one on the right. This is true for areas from urban to rural. And right, we kind of already knew this about metro areas because we had the data there. It turns out it's not only true for metro, but it's more true for non-metro. It's not only more true for non-metro and more true for small towns and rural areas, it's especially true for the Midwest. Quality of life leads to higher job growth and higher population growth. Here it is for the quality of the business environment. So there's actually no statistically significant relationship between the quality of the business environment and population growth or job growth. It just simply isn't there. So when I look at this data, what I see is, yes, right, are there people that might follow a job? Sure, right? But what is predominantly happening now is jobs are following people to where people want to live. So I often get people in the space of economic development who ask me about what do we need to do for regionalism and regionalization, right? How do we get these areas to work as a region and work together? And they ask me this question because focusing on the quality of the business environment and doing these traditional economic development incentives typically lead to job piracy, right? So that's my pirate stealing jobs there. You don't create a job, you just take it from a town over. And that might be true for the region. It is true for the region. It's also true for the country. It doesn't create a job, you just moved a job. And potentially you moved a job that didn't actually want to be there in the first place because there's something else about that place why they didn't want to be there in the first place. So what a strategy of traditional economic development does is it pits communities against each other. And they take jobs from each other. And it actually leads to lower job growth for both of them. But for quality of life, it's the opposite story. If the town next to you gets nicer, it helps your town, right? You can always drive and go visit that thing that makes it nice, whether it's a park, whether it's whatever it is that makes it nice that people like, a lake. You can go visit it. When someone improves their quality of life, it helps the neighbors around it. So it's kind of also like when your neighbor redoes the facade of their house and their front yard's looking real nice, helps your home value. Same here. I don't need a policy to make this true. I don't need all these counties to kind of come together and make an agreement not to steal jobs from each other. If you focus on quality of life, you will naturally help your own county, but you also help the runs around it. It naturally works together. You have more shared prosperity with this economic development strategy than you do with traditional economic development strategies. But we have a pandemic. So in the wake of the pandemic, right, we have more remote work. So remote work was increasing even before the pandemic, right? So my husband's been a remote worker since 2008, if I'm remembering right, for a long time. My neighbor thought he was totally unemployed for years. Not true, just remote work, right? The pandemic put remote work on steroids, right? So yes, some of it will come back down, and it has come back down, but it stayed at a pretty high level. We had a lot of people who wanted to do remote work and now can, which means they don't need that metro area for the job as much. Now they can live wherever they want. Where do they want to live? So this is actually looking at every county in America, metro to rural. The relationship between quality of life and population growth is 6 times larger in the wake of the pandemic than before. So if quality of life mattered before, and I should say all my data is for before the pandemic, except for this, it is 6 times more important now to make sure we get this right. All right, so if I've at least convinced you a little bit that quality of life really is economic development, right? So then the next question is, okay, so what makes a place nice, right? What do we do? What does my town do, right? So you saw all those coastal areas, and sometimes what I get from policymakers is, but we have snow. We'll never be able to compete, right? We have snow, right? Do natural amenities matter? Yes, on average we see if you have better natural amenities, so measured by the USDA Natural Amenity Index, you have higher quality of life. It's not true for the Midwest. So those same Illinois counties that were really focusing on the quality of the business environment also happen to be the counties with the highest natural amenity index. The counties that happen to have more natural amenities aren't focusing on them. They're focusing on the business environment. We have the exact opposite economic development strategy as many places across the US. And our economic development, our outcomes, show it. So I will say, I presented this to some policymakers from Marion, and I would like to say they now have a new mayor. Are you from Marion? I see a nod. They now have a new mayor, so they have made changes, I will say, recently in the last couple of years, right? I think more towns are starting to realize this. So I want to give some credit to Marion, that Marion is starting to see some big changes. But before this, not as many changes. All right, so when we look at what makes a place nice, it isn't the natural amenities. It's what you do with those natural amenities, right? So I have a photographer in Northeast Ohio, I'm going back to the Buckeye State for a minute, who said Northeast Ohio has no luxury of a geographic crown jewel. His words. We have nothing, no geographical crown jewel in Northeast Ohio. We have a Great Lake. We have a Great Lake. Most places in the entire world don't have that. And he couldn't even think of it. And he's from there, right? And I don't blame him, so I don't name him. I don't name names. But what he's saying is what people there think. When they think of Northeast Ohio, they don't think of our Great Lake. They might think of our burning river once. It doesn't burn anymore. I don't think that's a selling point, but it doesn't, right? The natural amenities don't matter. It's what you do with those natural amenities. Do you allow companies to pollute in your rivers and lakes, or do you build up your waterfront? Those lead to 2 very different outcomes, right? So one of the things that pulls out, so what we did with this data is we threw anything we could measure at it. So we actually have, I think it's around 200 or 300 amenities. And what our model does is it kind of churns through all of these amenities and all of these things that we can measure, and it spits out what's the most important, right? What matters most? So here I'm pulling out some of those things that matters most. Recreation, right? It's not the natural amenities itself, it's what you do with them. Do you have kayaking? Do you have boating? Do you have hiking trails? Do you have biking trails? What can you do with the space that you have to build on the natural amenities that you have, right? So this also means, in a way, there's no one size fits all. Right? If you don't have mountains, you're not going to have a ski slope. Well, not entirely true. We do have a ski slope off a little hill, right? We call it skiing. It's fine, and we love it, right? Use what you have, right? So what you have might be different than what they have, in the place where the person sitting next to you lives, right? You tailor the recreation to what you have. Do you have a river? Do you have a lake where you can go boating? Right, so yesterday I ran along the lakefront, and I won't say the name because I'll say it wrong, right? But I ran along the lakefront, and they were, doing ski jumping. That's really cool, right? Do you have something unique that gives you a comparative advantage that you can build on the assets you do have in terms of natural amenity? Also, arts and culture, right? I think of a lot of these as wants and needs, and there's a lot of wants there. We got a lot of wants, right? For most of us, our needs are actually pretty small. It's really the wants, right? So sometimes when I talk to people arts and culture, right, a lot of times what people hear is, oh, we need a new art gallery. And art galleries are great. I'm not saying anything against them. But arts and culture is more than just art galleries. In some place it might be an art gallery. And another place it could be, so I was in Macon and it was really all about, they have a lot of potters there and they do a lot of pottery and they have a whole space for it. But arts and culture can also be, so if you look at the top right, that's Lawrenceburg, Kentucky. It can be a splash pad that sprays a bourbon barrel of water on kids, right? That's cute, right? I don't know if it's appropriate or not. I don't really care. I don't think the kids know. The adults do, and they think it's pretty cute, right? They're building on what they have, right? And they're known for their bourbon trails, right? They have leaned heavy into this. And this town is actually doing pretty well, right? And they have things for all ages. So yes, no, kids are not drinking bourbon there, right? But you would still bring your kids there because you can go to a restaurant, mom, dad have a little bourbon, and the daytime maybe go to splash pad, and it's super cute. And it reminds you of kind of who you are, right? So a lot of this is also about having conversations with people about who you are. Why are people here? What do they really like about it? So health matters. We want healthy places. A lot of these go together, right? If you have recreation place, also promotes health. Access to health care. Another one, food stores, right? So sometimes, I know I think we have some Metro people in here too. So sometimes I talk to Metro people like, I don't think food stores really matter. I said, that's because you have it, right? When you have it, you don't think it matters that much. When you don't, you realize how much it really matters. Every time I do any analysis, food stores always pop up, right? It's wants and needs, right? You need to get your needs met. And then above that, the wants are all the cherry on top that we all want, right? We need access to food. We need access to health care, right? I've done a pandemic with children without childcare. Holy cow, do we need childcare? It doesn't go well without childcare. It did not go well, right? We need those needs met. But then we also want all those wants. So low crime rates, good schools. A lot of these things, rural areas naturally do and do it well. I don't often hear policymakers in rural areas say, I just want to know how to be like New York City. Never have I heard that. I do sometimes hear metro areas ask a similar question, right? And I don't think it's right for metro areas, right? So I've heard policymakers in Akron say, how do I be Cleveland? And we say, don't be Cleveland. The best you could ever be is a second-rate Cleveland. Be a first-rate Akron. So rural areas tend to get that a little better than sometimes the metro areas do. And they also naturally have a lot of the things people like, right? When we talk about our environment and recreation, that's a lot of rural areas right there. They're the places where we have our trees and our outdoors and the places that we want to be, and they have it naturally. They also naturally have lower crime rates. A lot of the things people like about living there, they naturally have, which is why we've always seen proximity to metro matter, because people have always liked living there. Good schools matter. Right? So if we bought a house, one of the first things a real estate agent will tell you, even if you're 75 years old, is we have good schools, right? Why do they tell a 75-year-old that? Because we know it matters for the home price. Good schools matter. Why? Because we choose to be in locations that have good schools. We need good schools for our kids to start off and allow them the opportunity. School spending matters. School spending is an economic development strategy. All of these things are. So sometimes when I present this, people can think I'm really poo-pooing the business. Like, oh, you're saying we shouldn't throw money at businesses, and you're really mean to those businesses and corporations. And at first I didn't get it. I was like, what are you talking about? This whole thing is about businesses. But I realized after listening and hearing what they're saying, that they weren't seeing what I was seeing, because I was in the data. And I know a lot of this when I talk about recreation, arts and culture, health, food stores, personal care places. Those are all businesses. Mm-hmm. Typically small businesses, typically locally owned businesses. Right, so when I look at, so this is a really nice indoor park. There's actually another one just a few miles from where I live that opened up. And so it was actually a dad of 3 boys who was like, man, could I use something to do with my 3 boys in the winter? Like, I need a place for them to be that's not in my house right now. And he opened up a small indoor playground, really small. You now have to get a reservation days in advance to go to this indoor playground. So if we look on the books, right, as a job creator, right, so he's got, him and his wife co-own it, and they employ 5, 6 people maybe. Ribbon cutting, not big. Ribbon cutting isn't the only thing, right? That indoor playground makes where I live in the winter so much nicer when I do want that playground. That has a bigger economic benefit than what you see on the books. Those small businesses provide the things that we need and want as people. And those things we need and want as people, those are the real economic drivers that make it a place where we want to be. So I wanted to look at business startups. So this is for every business that has an employee identification number. So kind of, are you a business who employs people? Just to see what this looked like. So what I found was higher estimated quality of life, and this is for small towns, is associated with more business startups, not the quality of the business environment. That quality of life is where we got those business startups. And this is only companies that have that EIN, the employee identification number. This isn't self-employment or if you don't employ another person. So it actually discounts, especially rural areas that are more likely to have a business that doesn't have an EIN. It's likely even larger effect. The businesses that you were trying to get to start up happen with higher estimated quality of life. So I'm gonna tell you a little story of Akron. We're going back to Buckeye State again. So we're try hard in Ohio to bring those businesses back, especially manufacturing. It was really where all those dollars go. So Akron, if you didn't know, is also the birthplace of punk music. So if you've heard of the Black Keys, they're from Akron. So if you look at, they'll say they're from Akron still on all their stuff, right? This is where this sound came from. So if you look in the middle, that's Jamie. So he actually toured with the Black Keys. He's one of their friends, the guitarist friends. And the guitarist of the Black Keys wanted his guitar to make a different sound. And he was also kind of this guy who was always a tinkerer. And he was like, I bet I can get your guitar to make a different sound. And he did. So he started making pedals. I'm not a guitar player, so I don't really understand this. But he started making pedals so that guitars can make different sounds. And he started making it for a lot of bands, well-known bands, like the Black Keys and other places. And he started getting so many requests, he had to start a business. His wife came into the business as well. This is now a place where we manufacture these pedals in Akron because it built on who we are and what people wanted. A lot of people wanted these different unique sounds for their guitar. And so if you walk around Akron, once a year we have an event called Porch Rocker, so that's the picture on the right, where we just simply walk around to everyone's porches, and on everyone's porches are different bands. Right? This is part of the culture of Akron. If you ask a lot of policymakers that have been around for a while about Akron, they'll tell you we're the rubber capital of the world. We were the rubber capital of the world. If you ask my students what they are, none of them will talk about rubber. Because that's not who I am. That's not who Akron is. Akron once was the rubber capital of the world, and there are people that still feel that, and I understand that. The problem is our young people don't feel it. They feel Akron is punk. Akron has Porch Rocker. We got a business because Akron is punk and Akron has Porch Rocker, right? It leaned into who we are now, and which it might be part of the rubber. So if the rubber industry is also kind of a very, so it's dirty, it's messy. You get your hands dirty. So a lot of the men, it was mostly men, their hands would be permanently stained black their entire life from working in that industry, right? So it's kind of a gritty industry. It's not surprising that punk came from that, right? This kind of grittiness. So if you just ask business owners, why'd you locate there? Why'd you start a business there? They'll say, well, this had talented workers, and it had the quality of life that I want and that my workers want. That's why I started the business. Right, so what we've seen is historically, if you look back to 1980, households and businesses, they didn't like the same locations. They disagreed. They wanted different locations and places to be. It's not true anymore. Increasingly, businesses and households want the same location. Why? Because businesses are going to where people want to be. That's where they can find the workforce they want. Ball Corporation moved to Colorado because they leaned heavy into their aerospace industry. And when they leaned heavy into their aerospace industry, moving to Colorado is how they could attract aerospace workers. So my student's boyfriend is in aerospace. I was like, oh, that makes sense. So when we look at this economic development strategy of focusing on quality of life, instead of that vicious circle we saw before, we get more of a virtuous circle. We see higher quality of life attracts people, it keeps people, The people who it attracts and keeps are more likely to start businesses. Those small businesses also then in turn increase quality of life, which further attracts people and starts businesses. So when we look at who the job creators are, those small, locally owned firms, the ones started by the people who we already know love that town because they're there, right? They have the biggest economic impact. So when we are looking for superheroes, there's no Superman. So as economists, sometimes I have to say things that's like really a downer. I'm gonna try and end on an upper. There's no Superman coming to save your town. I don't care if you're rural or metro. No one's coming to save your town. It's not gonna happen, stop waiting. Superman doesn't exist. I haven't told my kid yet that, don't tell him yet, right? Superman doesn't exist, but we do. There's no Superman coming because we haven't realized in a lot of places that we are that superhero. No one's gonna love your town like the people who are already there. No one's gonna be able to build on the assets it has like the people who already know the assets it has and already love those assets. So what we need to do is really foster this kind of entrepreneurial culture of building on the assets we have, helping people get what they need, helping people get what they want, and a way to creatively use those assets to also fix the problems. If there's something that we don't have, that we need, or that we want, how can we use those assets to repurpose them into something new, to fix those problems, to give people what they need and what they want? We have to be the superheroes that we've been waiting for. Thank you. And I think we've got some time for questions. If there are, yes. So I think, so we do have a mic there, or if you're a loud talker, so.
I'm a loud talker.
Perfect, me too.
What's the role of broadband in access
Oh, yes.
to rural communities?
Oh, broadband, love broadband. So a lot of rural communities are already nice and have been nice all along. And some of them are already nice and don't need to do anything. But what they don't have, for example, is broadband, access to markets. So now if we think about roads, right, why did we build roads? Why do we have roads? Why do roads exist? Roads are a way that we get consumers to markets and get markets to consumers. Broadband to me is a new road, right? If we want to get people to a market, now they need broadband. Think of how much online shopping everybody does, right? We need broadband. So a lot of rural areas, especially broadband, can really help that rural area that's already a nice place to live. It just needs better access. So we talked about, being near a metro area helps. Broadband is basically the same story, right? So especially with remote work, right? Now I don't need to commute to a city. I could basically have a meeting with my coworkers in my own home. So what we need for a lot of that is broadband. Yeah, broadband is a great multiplier, especially for those areas that are already nice. Give them a little broadband, they'll be good. In some areas. Yes.
I've lived in communities that are places that people have wanted to move to, but have had serious transportation and connectivity issues. So I didn't know if you had a thought on the importance or lack of importance of connectivity from that standpoint.
Yeah, so the question was about how important connectivity is. So I'll tell you, even in my own town, we talk about connectivity a lot. So a lot of places realize that we need connection to other people, and so we often think about that as broadband, as roads. For us, we talk a lot about not having sidewalks. But sometimes what I think gets lost in the discussion of connectivity is what we're connecting to. And so this is especially true for urban areas if you look at their highway system. So when we built our national highway system, the goal was to connect cities. But what ended up happening in a lot of cities is it ended up paving over neighborhoods and businesses. We took out the places to go to in order to have a connection, right? So when we talk about connectivity, I get a little nervous when we only talk about the road or the broadband, but not what you're connecting to or from, right? So a road doesn't matter, right? A road to nowhere isn't connectivity. It isn't. No one's gonna drive it because it goes to nowhere, right? So the same is true with broadband, with any area, that when we talk about connectivity, it has to be not only the road or broadband, but who and what are you connecting? So in a lot of areas, they might not have connectivity because they don't have a food store, right? So it's not, they have a road, but there's no food store to go to, right? So when we think about connectivity, we have to think in a kind of a more holistic way of what do people need in terms of jobs, training, food, things to go to, recreation, right? How do we better connect them with that? I don't know if that answered your question. Yes.
Love your data and small businesses and things like that, but your quality of life in rural areas should sound a lot like Detroit suburbs. So how would you apply that to places that are like Redmond, or places who are truly are in the middle of nowhere, don't have the tax base for schools or healthcare or
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So if you look at, when we talked about those rural areas that did well, right? So why, oh, I'm going way back. So why does the definition of rural areas matter so much? Ah, there it is. Right, how did those rural areas do well? They turned from rural to urban. Which areas turned from rural to urban? Suburbs, right? The suburbs did, right? So I have a friend who's actually in the urban space, and she kind of, I think it was kind of pejorative, it's like, oh, the suburbs only do so well because they cater to families. That's right. That's why the suburbs do so well. They cater to families. They cater to the people that are there, right? So rural areas, this is harder, right? So if, you know, in what is now a suburb of where I live, right? If I really need a hospital, I can drive to it pretty quickly, right? Not too bad. In a rural area, it might be different, especially when we see hospital closures. That might be different, right? So I live near a historic downtown that was once rural, still have a cow, but also I can walk to a grocery store too, right? So we also need to really get a hold of what needs do we not have if it's a food store, and how can we get it, right? So what we've done even in Akron, is we have a number of food deserts. So it was basically a public-private partnership to put a grocery store somewhere. Basically, the grocery store on its own wasn't coming. And for a variety of reasons, but said, all right, we'll put some money into the city and we'll give it a grocery store. The grocery store is actually doing fantastic now, like fantastic. I really don't even know why it needed public money. It's doing so well, right? But it did. And so we have to have a discussion of what do we need, and can we have creative ways of getting there? So I also, there's another area in Ohio where, when we talk about public transportation, right? A lot of us think about metro areas, and we think about subways, and we think about big buses, right? How do we get that in a rural area? Are there creative ways where we can get a van, right? And have public transportation that's just a van, and then can get people to different areas. So I think the challenge in rural areas is harder, how we get these things. I think it means that we have to be more creative, and creative ways to get those things. And it also, I think, means we need more people to work together, right? If that grocery store isn't coming to get that, how do we do it? Is there a way that we can have the city work together? Can we get federal grants to help us get that food store, to make sure that we have it? And I also think it means a serious discussion about funding, right? So sometimes what I get from policymakers is, great, where do we get the money from? How do we make our place nicer? Statewide, in Ohio, we're giving $7 billion to Intel, with a B. We've got the money. I don't want to hear from policymakers we don't have the money when they hand a $7 billion check over to a company. We have the company. It's just where we're choosing to spend it, right? And we live in one of the richest countries in the world. So to tell me, like, we've got a lot of scarcity and we just don't have the funding to say, like, put our kids through school to train them to become the workers and the taxpayers they will once be, I just find it's a hard argument. We've got the money, it's just how we're spending it. And so some of it we need to think about funding, right? So our funding is typically done for schools, with property taxes. Where are property taxes super high, and where do they pay them anyway? In a suburb, right? Where you have wealthy people living there, right? So we really need to seriously think about how we fund schools. Yes?
So you talked about quality of life and people choosing to live one place and then traveling to other areas to work. So I'm on the Rock County Board. We are starting a study on, we have an ad hoc committee that's been formed to look at rail service from Rock County to, from our area to Madison, Milwaukee. Is that correct? Randy, rail service. Our study that's going from one area to the other. What have you seen as far as the increase in people traveling from one area to another to work, from outside of like a rural area to go to another area to work? What is that beginning to look like? What is that percentage of increase in folks actually doing that? From what I understand, that's actually significantly increased since COVID.
It has.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yep, so now that we can do remote work, we see people moving to places that they are just simply nice places to live, period, right? May not be big urban centers because they don't need to be near their job. So we see that increasingly happening. So when we look at what that looks like, that was actually happening even before the pandemic, where we saw that. So part of why we see the rural areas who became a lot of these suburbs is because they were so close to a metro. A lot of what we see in the rural areas that are doing well are near that metro area. So I think what it also gives is rural areas that aren't near a metro a little more hope than they maybe had. We said, hey, just be near a metro, right? If you're not near a metro, it's not very helpful. Like, you can't pick up and move your county, right? So I think connectivity does matter. So we had the question about connectivity, and that means rail, it might mean broadband, depends on your area what connectivity means. Increasingly with remote work, that's gonna mean broadband. But we also need to remember in those areas, even things like, if I don't have childcare, it doesn't matter if there's rail or broadband. It just doesn't, right? So you have to have some of those areas. So a lot of those areas that maybe would be helped by broadband, if there's no system of childcare, whether that looks like a daycare center or someone's house, right? That's gonna be hard, right? That's gonna be really hard. So I've also done some studies, even just breaking out things by gender and the differences in preferences. So men tend to really like having more public transportation. They like it more. Not that women don't like it, they just like it more. Women tend to like being closer to where they live. They don't want to travel as much. We don't like commuting, right? If your school calls, come pick up your kid, you don't want to have to drive 40 minutes to go pick up your kid, right? Nobody likes traffic. Women especially hate traffic, right? So it also tells me in these rural areas, if you're looking for who might move, talk to women. Right? So we also notice in the Midwest and small towns, women show a stronger preference for those areas than men did. They liked them more. So I quoted, up there, I quoted actually Ed Glazer, who's a pretty well-known urban economist, so he wrote Triumph of the City, for anyone that read Triumph of the City. I like to point out, at some point he's gonna find out I'm talking about him. He lives in a suburb. Why? That's where his wife wanted to live. So a lot of the people who we need to be talking to, who I think are maybe, although I do see a lot of women in the audience, a lot of women driving these decisions that we might not realize are women. Women also especially want parks. Everyone loves parks. Women love them more, right? So it means you really have to get your parks right? And that makes sense, right? I want someplace to take my kid to, right? There's only so much I can be in a basement with them, right? At some point, I need to get out of my basement and not be playing with that, train track anymore. Women really like it. So it also means having these conversations and realizing who the people that you most likely are to get, and also making sure, right, it's not just about that rail, right, but childcare is a big issue, and one that I think we need to have a bigger discussion in this country. And when we hear, also I will say, when we see studies of universal childcare and the places that have done it and who it's benefited, we often think, oh, this will really help metro areas. It actually helps rural areas the most. Rural areas are helped the most by universal childcare, and it's not close.
We have a question in the back.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, back's harder to see.
Thanks, Ruben.
Thank you.
Thanks. I have two questions that developed while I was waiting. So the first is, this is an economic development and diversity summit, and you've talked now just a little bit about gender, but I wonder if you could speak more to racial and ethnic diversity and how that intersects the data you presented. I don't need to say the because, I hope, to this audience, but the list of amenities might be different or might be differently accessed, for sure, I would say. And my second question is, what about the political climate? What about how people feel, oh, thanks, Derek. What about how people feel, and it's on. I'm still giving my TED talk here, people. That is every headline about people under attack where they live. And that might be too fresh for your data, but I'm curious if you and your team and colleagues have thought about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I didn't have it here. So we have done so one of our research is Emily Warnell, a rural sociologist, and she does a lot of amazing work about kind of broadly what we call capital, and one of them is social capital. And social capital is really about the links we have to each other and the health of those links, and how we can measure that, how we can improve upon that, to get a little bit at what you're saying. And so one thing with our initial research on that is social capital matters, right? So if people view an area as welcoming, that is great for economic development. We don't view it that way. We view it as like, oh, it's nice that people smile at you instead of like walking by you on the street, right? But it is economic development, right? Those culture, I think a lot of economics has not done as much on culture as it should. So we're starting to do more. But that social capital, that culture and those connections really matter. And so it also means when we think about people and what people want and need just as a species, I know we like to think, I did this all myself and, the whole bootstraps thing and, working hard and everything is important. We're a communal species, right? We need connections to each other, and we don't often talk about or tout that as much. So what that also means, and when we think about potentially the role of government, is how do we make those connections, right? Governments build roads and build parks because one person doing it, it just doesn't make sense for one person to build $1 million park that a bunch of people are going to use most of the time, unless you just have so much money to throw away, which most of us don't. Right, so a lot of what government and what quality of life does is, can we build those spaces where people come together? If that is a park where, if it's an amphitheater, how do we build those spaces where people can naturally come together? And so what I also hear from rural policymakers is sometimes that's the grocery store, and the grocery store is where you naturally have these meetups that were unplanned, and you say, hi, what's going on? And it's really the way that we view our city and our economy as a place for us to be together, where you can build those cultural connections that I think a lot of us feel we've maybe lost in the last few years, right? So a lot of these spaces help to work toward that, I think. And that's also what I think Emily would say as well. As far as when we're thinking about differences in preferences, so most of my work on difference in preferences has been about gender. So there's been less that I've done on race and ethnicity. So a lot of the, other than if you just look at, if we started to break down county demographics, which we could do, but I'm not done yet. So on that, one thing that we do find, and when we talk to policymakers, is you have to talk to people about what they like about their place and why they like it. You cannot wait for people to come to you, which is often what I hear from policymakers as well. Nobody showed up to the council meeting. I've got 3 kids, right? And when I've got 3 kids and one's breastfeeding, I'm not coming to a council meeting. And it's not because I don't care about my town. That's often the assumption we get, well, if you didn't show up, you didn't care. That is completely untrue. So what that means is it's on policymakers. For whoever your town is and whoever there, you have to go out and seek what those people like about those towns, what they need, what they want. And sometimes policymakers think that they're going to hear some, off the wall stuff, but they usually hear things like, I don't have a food store. I just need a grocery store. What can we do to get a food store? They're usually pretty simple asks. And people typically, the things that they want can be pretty simple if we just go out and talk with them. So I also work with an organization called the Knight Foundation. Have you heard about the Knight Foundation? So one thing that they're particularly good at is reaching out to communities where they're at. They don't hold a town hall in downtown. It's not in the city council building. They go to a community and they go to a park in that community and they sit down and say, come talk to us at this time, or we'll say, hey, come on over. And sometimes that can mean having a conversation. So in one community where they just put in a new nature center, it's a town where we used to do nothing but dump in their lake. And it was a red-lined area, but then we paved it over so that they would move to this area where we dumped in the lake. And the people there were pissed. And they didn't argue with them. They let them be pissed. They can be pissed. It's okay to be angry. A lot of times when people are angry, it comes from a place of love for their community and the people in those communities. So I think to me, all of this, how you actually do the work, is you have to go find people. Go find them where they're at. If they're in a bar, Go to a bar, have a drink, start up a conversation. If they're at the park with their kids, go to a park, start up a conversation. We have to find people where they're at to figure out what are your wants, what are your needs, what do we not have, what would keep you here. If you're already here, what do you have that would make this place nicer for you? And that includes conversations with a lot of people, and a lot of people who maybe were traditionally not represented in government. I don't know if that gets at a little bit of your question. Yes, I'll do another back one, because the back I think I have a hard time seeing.
Is this on?
Yes.
Okay, so my question is to see if you have any data sets around this in affordable housing. So as we start to see housing costs increase throughout the nation, they're especially increasing in more desirable areas. And so what kind of data do we have or recommendations you have for communities that continue to want to be a good place to live, attract people, but also not displace or prevent low to middle income households from living there?
Yeah, that is a great question, and not controversial at all from where I live. So, oh man, we could talk for another hour about zoning and regulations. We tend to have a lot of very restrictive zoning, and then we ask why we don't have any affordable housing. We tend to restrict what homeowners can do. If I want to put an apartment above my garage, I can't, because some policymaker said I'm not allowed to. Right? We have a lot of regulations when it comes to housing and zoning that if we took them away, a lot of affordable issues would go away. The problem is that could be controversial. When you live in a nice place, you often want to keep it nice. And the way people sometimes behave to keep it nice is through not having other people come in. Right? So this requires a lot of conversations and a lot of the communities of why we should get rid of some of these restrictive zonings and other things that are preventing houses from being built in the places people want to live. So on the flip side of that, we also have a lot of actually pretty nice places doing everything they can to make their place not a nice place to live. So what does that mean? It pushes everyone to the places that are nice places to live and makes housing unaffordable there. So if we have more places around the country that build on the assets they do have, making it a nice place to live, that's fewer people being crammed in the few places that are focusing on quality of life. So it's a little bit kind of twofold. So one is, and it also can be, well, it can't be. So this is my most unpopular opinion, probably as an economist. I hate the mortgage interest rate deduction. It doesn't help people buy homes. We know this through research. It helps people buy mansions. That's what it does. But as a homeowner, like we all get money from it. We spend more, and it's not close, on the mortgage interest rate deduction to help people buy McMansions than we do on public housing, and it's not close, right? So I'm saying, this is really pie in the sky dream now, right? If we just got rid of that and explained to people, if you really looked at, especially for middle and lower socioeconomic class people, you would pay higher taxes, sometimes in just a couple $100 a year, that's it. Higher income people, they would pay a couple $1,000 more a year when we take it away, because they're living in a mansion and they pay a whole bunch of mortgage interest on their stuff. You take that away and put it into affordable housing, first of all, you wouldn't even need all that money to fix it. It would also fix the issue. But that's at the federal level, and that means talking with people in Congress, which, yes.
Dr. Weinstein, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, I can also stay, so if there's any questions, I will stay as well.
Thank you for this great presentation. Let's give her a hand, please.